We affirm resolve the United States federal government should prioritize reducing the federal debt over promoting economic growth. Our sole contention is the developing debt disaster. The developing world is facing an impending debt crisis. More 18 of the Atlantic Council writes that both Turkey and Argentina are set to experience a recession, and if no action is taken, these two countries could default on their debt, triggering widespread investor panic. Beyond these two countries, number 18 of the Wall Street Journal writes, the risk of a global crisis is rapidly rising as over 45% of low-income countries are at a high risk of default, up from just 25% from 5 years ago. With comparatively poor levels of infrastructural development and high social stratification, these defaults would push millions into poverty. For example, NERD 14 of the Leibniz Institute for Economic Research articulates that when a similar crisis broke out in 1997, the living standards of millions plummeted and countries lost years of economic development in an instant. At the heart of this looming disaster is the American debt crisis. When America borrows more money, it does so by selling more bonds. Patel 18 of the Financial Times explains that to fund the rapidly increasing deficit, the American government issued over $1 trillion of government bonds in 2018, flooding the global bond market with American treasuries. This flood of treasury bonds has created the developing world's debt catastrophe in two ways. First, by reversing investment flows. Capretta 18 of the American Enterprise Institute emphasizes that just as American debt has exploded, so too has the supply of U.S. treasury bonds. To global debt lenders, U.S. bonds represent the safest asset on the market, meaning with more American treasuries available for purchase, the supply of lenders for emerging markets has gone down dramatically as they shift to buy more U.S. bonds. Indeed, Patel 18 of the Financial Times continues that already emerging economies are losing over $5 billion a week in investment due to the high levels of U.S. debt. Problematically, Edwards 18 of Business Insider writes that as the global supply of capital shifts away from emerging markets and towards U.S. Treasury bonds, it becomes impossible for markets like Turkey to find lenders to finance their debt, pushing countries to the brink of default. Second, by amplifying dollar-denominated debt. Hicks 18 of U.S. News writes that when the government issues more bonds to pay for their federal debt, interest rates on Treasury bonds skyrocket because the demand for loans rises. Indeed, Sebula 14 of Jackson University analyzes rates in America from 1971 to 2012, concluding that every 1% increase in the U.S. deficit has resulted in a 0.21% increase in interest rates on Treasury bonds. When interest rates rise in America, they amplify the debt problems of emerging markets. Bartenstein 18 of Bloomberg explicates that over 2/3 of debt held by emerging markets is dollar denominated, meaning that these countries are borrowing in dollars and not their own currencies. Unfortunately, Setzer 18 of the Foreign Affairs magazine explains that higher U.S. interest rates cause lenders to hike the interest rates on bonds in emerging markets since they would need a higher return of investment in order to compete with the safer American treasuries. Overall, 4011 of the International Monetary Fund quantifies this effect, finding every 1% increase in the debt to GDP ratio in the U.S. results in a 0.1% increase in interest rates in emerging markets. Higher interest rates are devastating for these economies. Richter 18 of Business Insider writes that through 2025, emerging markets will face $2.7 trillion in U.S. denominated debt that has to be paid off. So higher borrowing costs would make it significantly harder for countries to pay off its debt and heighten the risk that these countries default. By prioritizing the reduction of the federal debt, the American government would necessarily borrow less, putting fewer treasuries on the market. A vote for the AF prevents investors from fleeing emerging markets and drives down interest rates, thus making debt much more manageable for the world's most vulnerable countries. Thus, we affirm.
Thank you.
Jackie 98 resolved, the United States federal government should prioritize reducing the federal debt over promoting economic growth. Our sole contention is improving infrastructure. McBride from the Council on Foreign Relations writes that in 2017, the nation's infrastructure averaged a D, meaning that conditions are exhibiting significant deterioration with a strong risk of failure, estimating that there is a total infrastructure gap of nearly $1.5 trillion needed by 2025. Infrastructure spending rebuilds and promotes economic growth. A 2014 University of Maryland study found that infrastructure investments added as much as $3 to GDP growth for every dollar spent, with a bigger effect during a recession. Fortunately, a negative ballot means that this is likely to increase. Schaefer 2018 from NPR explains that infrastructure is one of the few issues on which Trump and Democrats might be able to agree. Both sides say they're willing to work together on a plan to rebuild the nation's roads, bridges, transit, and water systems. In fact, Reinhardt 2018 quantifies that nearly 8 in 10 Republicans and 54% of Democrats agreed with Trump's planned $200 billion increase on federal infrastructure spending. Moreover, even if infrastructure spending does not necessarily increase, an affirmative ballot would cut current infrastructure spending, as Liebenwolf 2017 from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities writes that in order to lower deficits, Trump's proposed budget cut infrastructure. Bibba from the Huffington Post contextualized in 2018 that this budget included a 28.6% cut to transportation spending from 2017 to 2023. There are two impacts. The first is disaster relief. Behadar 2018 explains that the United States has seen more billion-dollar natural disaster events recently than ever before, with climate models projecting an increase in both intensity and frequency. In 2017 alone, natural disasters resulted in $306 billion losses, setting the costliest disaster year on record. The Pew Research Center in 2017 quantifies the economic impact, writing that for every dollar invested in actions to reduce disaster losses, the nation saves about $4 in future costs. As a result, the University of Pennsylvania found in 2018 that Congress recently passed a $90 billion disaster funding bill, and much of the funding is for repairing infrastructure. But prioritizing reducing the debt would curtail this progress, because in 2013, when the House was under control of conservatives who were worried about the debt, the New York Times writes that storm aid that funded infrastructure became ensnared in the larger debate over deficits. And as a result, House leaders first offered a $17 billion bill, which was much smaller than the eventual $50 billion bill that allowed House conservatives to lower the total cost, which is crucial because Krauss 2017 from the Brookings Institute writes that disasters are responsible for at least 100 deaths cause county-level poverty rates to increase by over 1 percentage point. The second impact is increasing mobility. Karnani 2011 explains that the best way to alleviate poverty is to increase the income of the poor by providing productive employment. Infrastructure increases employment in two ways. The first is by creating jobs. McKinsey estimates that increasing U.S. infrastructure spending by 1% of GDP would add 1.5 million jobs to the economy. These jobs with relatively low barriers of entry are both high-paying and long-term. Kane 2015 from Brookings writes that infrastructure occupations pay up to 30% more to low-income workers. And Fuentes 2014 continues that 77% of infrastructure workers are primarily concerned with operation, which maintain assets into the long term. Which is why Kane 2015 concludes that infrastructure jobs represent long-term, well-paid opportunities for the 2/3 of U.S. workers who lack four-year college degrees. Second is increasing access. In 2011, the Brookings Institution estimated that only 30% of metropolitan jobs were reachable within 90 minutes via public transit, and only 1/4 of low and middle skill industries are accessible using the existing commuting infrastructure. As a result, Whirling 2014 explains that improvements to all types of infrastructure would imply a net gain in real income of $4,400 per household by 2030. Thus, Wingate.
Really quickly, before cross, can I see this piece of evidence that says that there's like $5 billion a week that like countries lose $5 billion a week because like investors are fleeing? Start with 24 seconds again.
So your entire case is about Trump's infrastructure plan, right?
Yeah.
So why hasn't it passed so far?
Okay, so the reason it didn't pass earlier is because in 2017, Republicans controlled both the House and the Senate, meaning that they didn't really need to compromise on an infrastructure bill because they could just pursue things like tax cuts. The reason that Democrats didn't want to compromise was because they were still holding on to hope that in the 2018 midterms they would take over with the House and the Senate. The difference is now the new set of congressmen, which have only had 23 days in office, are saying that they all need legislative victories in order to gain re-election. That's why now, particularly, the infrastructure bill is going to pass because this is one of the only areas where they can actually compromise. Can I have a question?
Yeah.
So why do people invest in developing countries or
Because
emerging markets?
it's all part of the global bonds market. So when if the supply of U.S. bonds is that's gone, then they invest in emerging
Wait,
markets.
but why do they want to
also,
invest in emerging markets?
They also get higher returns.
Okay, so they invest in emerging markets because they get high returns, right? And they invest in the U.S. market because it's a safe bond. So how are these two the same incentive?
What do you mean?
It's different incentives, right? So the two shouldn't trade
You
off.
say that, but they're both in the same global bonds market, right? If people can no longer buy the U.S. bonds because everyone's
Wait, it doesn't matter because if I'm an investor who's looking for a safe asset, I'll buy U.S. bonds. If I'm an investor who's looking for a high return, I'll buy developing country bonds. Just because they're in the same market doesn't mean the same people buy them.
We would contest that. But can I have a question?
Yeah.
Okay, so when was this Trump's infrastructure plan first proposed?
2017.
2017. Okay, so why were okay. Do you have a question?
Yeah.
Okay.
So on the second one, why do developing countries have to increase interest rates if we have debt? If the U.S. has a high debt?
It's just that when the U.S. has higher debt, then if the U.S. continues to borrow and finance its debt, then it sells more bonds, which means that there's an increased demand for borrowing, and so they're going to increase interest rates. And at that point, developing countries also
Wait. Why does an increased demand for borrowing increase interest rates?
Because
Does it increase interest rates in developing countries or in the U.S.?
for bonds of the U.S.
So you're telling me because there's more demand in the United States, interest rates rise in the United States.
Yeah.
If there was more demand, then why couldn't they just sell those bonds at a lower interest rate? The whole point of having an interest rate is to attract investors, right? But if you're telling me that we've already attracted those investors, then why do we have to
the
increase
demand
interest
for
rates?
borrowing increased, so now they have to compete, and whoever can pay the higher interest rates, get the bond. Can I have
Wait,
a
but
question?
if there's more
Wait,
demand,
can I have
then
a
that
question?
yeah, go for
Okay,
it.
so going back to your infrastructure plan, does it have will it have disaster relief when it passes?
Yeah, and even if it doesn't, we tell you that you just cut disaster relief in and afterwards. It doesn't really matter.
Okay.
Is everyone ready? Okay. Time starts now. Start at the top. Even if they win their entire case, they still lose the round. These developing nations are going to outweigh for two reasons. The first is that these countries have a much worse safety net because they aren't the world's reserve currency, so they aren't able to expand fiscal stimulus at a large enough scale during recessions to get out of the recession because they don't have the fiscal space to do so, which means that recessions last a lot longer, and in general, these people are less able to get out of recessions. But secondly, more importantly, we would say that these economies in general are less durable and experience higher levels of poverty, which means that any dollar increase or decrease in their income matters a lot more than the amount of change in income in America, which means that we would say that this analysis means that that developing nations is always going to outweigh their case. But let's go to their case about infrastructure. There's three main responses I'm going to give to the contention. The first is that municipal bonds which fund infrastructure on a local level are going to be harmed when you vote for them in two reasons. The first is crowding out. What Samuelson of MIT writes is that when the US borrows a lot, money goes to US Treasury bonds and sucks away capital from the rest of the bond market. The problem is, what Hudson 16 says is that that municipal bonds for local infrastructure are one of the most common alternatives to Treasury bonds. So when the supply of Treasury bonds takes more capital, there's less capital left for municipal bonds. But secondly, more importantly, is going to be a credit downgrade. What Burke's 11 says is that if America doesn't take action to pass a debt reduction policy now, one of the three rating agencies is going to downgrade America's debt from a AAA rating to a AA rating. And that's really problematic because what 018 of MarketWatch writes is that this year, Fitch, one of the three largest credit agencies, is already threatening to downgrade our debt. If this happens, that's really detrimental for municipal bonds. Because what Mart 11 says is that when the US debt gets downgraded, it also results in downgrades on municipal and state level bonds across the board because these rating agencies don't want local actors to have a higher credit rating than U.S. debt. When that happens, their interest rates are a lot higher because of the fact that their credit rating is a lot lower. People are less willing to lend with them with the lower credit rating. This has two implications on their case. First, we would say that federal spending is a lot worse than municipal local level spending because Rookie 17 says that federal investment is misallocated and it goes to areas where it's politically the best for politicians to do so because of lobbying into certain areas. On the other hand, municipal bonds are given to local politicians who don't have the sway of special interests affecting them. But that's why Oyakago in 2015 writes, in the past 9 years, we've seen $1.65 trillion of investment due to municipal bonds, which means the municipal bonds are always the preferable alternative to their case. If you really want infrastructure spending, you're not going to go through the political process of Congress, you're going to give it to the local level. Two more responses. The first is the GAIN Act. What Kelly 18 writes is right now in Congress there's a bipartisan piece of legislation that both Republicans and Democrats support called the GAIN Act, where it sells for federal assets and 50% of the revenues it gets goes to reducing the debt and the other 50% goes to infrastructure. This has two implications on this case. First, it implies that there is no trade-off between reducing the debt and infrastructure spending, which means that their advocacy is not topical. But second, it means that when you vote for us and you preclude the current plans on the table, like the Trump's plan, what Free Market 18 says that Trump's plan is really bad because the money only goes to wealthy areas, you instead shift to the GAIN Act. And the GAIN Act is preferable because the GAIN Act targets specific areas that need the money a lot more, so the investment is a lot better in our world. But the third reason that you're going to vote for us is because if we don't do anything now, infrastructure spending is going to be crowded out anyways. Because what Peterson Foundation writes is due to rising interest rates right now and rising debt right now, our interest payments are set to skyrocket. Indeed, Code 16 writes that in 10 years, 99% of our budget is going to go to mandatory items and interest payments, crowding out any discretionary spending on things like infrastructure. However, what Peterson Foundation writes right now is that if you cut and start reducing the debt right now, you only need 1.9% of the budget cut for every year until 2048. If you wait 5 years, those cuts are 21% larger. If you wait 10 years, those cuts are 53% larger, which means that we have to cut more infrastructure spending if we wait. Now is the time to do so. This link turns every single piece of analysis in their case, because right now it's an inevitability. You should vote F.
I'm going to start on the night case. Start on the developing countries argument.
He said that developing countries are going to outweigh any type of impact in today's debate. There's two reasons why the negative also links in developing countries. First, because lack of United States growth eventually reverberates throughout the economy. We would say that if the US slows down its economic growth, this has a reverberatory effect across the globe as investors start pulling assets and stop investing in other countries. But second of all, we would say that if you're going to actually cut the deficit like in the affirmative rule, you would cut things like foreign aid that directly go to these developing countries, especially because in times of past, when Obama tried to pass laws in 2013 to try to appease the Tea Party Republicans who wanted to reduce deficits, he cut foreign aid. So we would say this is a much more direct link because this is aid that is actually going to developing countries. Let's go to the negative case. The first thing he talks about is municipal bonds. I would say that there's two reasons right off the bat you don't vote for this case. First, because municipal bonds are not enough to actually stimulate federal infrastructure spending. This is really important because McBride said that despite municipal bonds, our infrastructure right now is pretty trash. I would say in cases like disaster relief, there is no way that a local government can raise that amount of money in such little time in order to spend money and recover from things like disasters, which require a lot of money to recover from. So I would say on scale alone, federal government spending is a lot better. But let's look at the individual arguments. First, they talk about crowding out. The problem with this is that investment is not zero sum. In fact, Brady writes that there is enough investment to go around that investors can buy things like treasury bonds and also corporate bonds and other bonds that they want to buy at the same time. So at the end of the day, investment isn't zero sums here. But second of all, they say that credit rates are going to downgrade the debt to GDP ratio, downgrade debt ratings. The problem with this, as I'll explain later, the University of Maryland finds that for every dollar you invest in infrastructure, you increase GDP growth by $3. This is really important because what determines the debt rating is not necessarily the actual amount of debt, it's the debt to GDP ratio, because that actually determines how likely it is that you actually pay back your debt. So if we can prove that GDP growth is going to outpace debt growth, then debt to GDP ratio shrinks even though our debt is actually increasing. But finally, they say there are two reasons why municipal bonds are together. Group them both because I'm just going to tell you that municipal bonds on scale don't raise enough money to actually go to federal infrastructure spending. Then they talk about the GAIN Act. Two responses. First, the GAIN Act hasn't passed. There's not enough support for the GAIN Act. Just because it was created by a Democrat and a Republican doesn't mean that Democrats are going to support it in the House and Republicans are going to support it in the Senate. But second of all, we would say that this act is specific to selling assets by the Department of Agriculture. We would say that's not enough to actually start reducing the debt. You still need federal spending to start spending in infrastructure. But third, they talk about crowding out. The problem with this is that actually they say that, well, interest payments are going to rise. The problem with this is that they say we're going to have to cut later. The problem here is that why can't we just borrow money to pay off this interest? They don't really tell you why all of a sudden cuts are going to be incredibly necessary in the future. Then let's go to the affirmative case. A couple of big problems. First, realize that bonds from developing countries are always going to be less preferable just because in developing countries they're more likely to have problems like corruption and systemic economic problems that will prevent their bonds from actually becoming more secure than U.S. bonds. This is really critical because Jennifer gives the analysis that as long as U.S. bonds are more preferable than developing country bonds, then investors who are investing in U.S. bonds won't shift to bonds from developing countries. They'll just shift to bonds from other developed nations like China, for example, which has a AAA rating. That means bonds from Argentina and Turkey are never going to be bought by investors who would rather buy U.S. bonds. But let's go on to the individual warrants. First, they talk about investment flows. Again, like I said, investors who buy U.S. bonds and investors who buy bonds from developing nations have the different incentives. She concedes this in first cross when she tells you that investors who buy bonds from developing nations are looking for high returns and not necessarily more security. But second of all, realize that investors don't buy U.S. bonds, they're going to go buy Chinese bonds. Bloomberg 2019 finds that this is already happening because Chinese bonds are very similar to U.S. bonds in terms of security. They would never actually go buy bonds from developing countries. Then on to dollar denomination. First, realize that this is contingent on U.S. bond interest rates increasing, which in turn is contingent on demand for bonds decreasing. There are two reasons why demand would never decrease. First, because Bloomberg explains the demand is always high because treasury bonds are always seen as the safer investment compared to things like stocks. This is why demand for treasury bonds increases in times like a recession, for example. Second, because of debt to GDP ratio, the only way investors would increase their debt interest rates is because they think that the U.S. can't pay it back. That doesn't happen if the GDP ratio decreases. But third, realize that foreign investors, because they're buying Chinese bonds right now, China's increasing its buying of U.S. bonds because it wants to keep its currency artificially low. So we would say, in any case, it is likely that demand for U.S. bonds would never decrease, never triggering the interest rate rise they talk about.
Okay, we'll take time beginning now. U.S. economy growing at a fast speed or a low speed right now?
At a fast speed.
Okay, so what makes you think that America's economy is going to slow down when you vote neg?
What do you mean?
Like, you tell me in response to my weighing overview that low U.S. growth reverberates, but if U.S. growth is high, why are we worried about growth slowing down when you
Right.
vote for you?
Right now, that's because right now U.S. growth is on the verge of slowing down.
So
We would say that investing in infrastructure
why is it
probably
on-
will prevent this slowdown.
Why is it on the verge of slowing down?
Just because in natural economies it like
So,
slows down.
like, in terms of the business cycle, why does the business expansion have to end now?
What do you mean, like?
Like, why can't the business expansion go for another
So like
5,
one
10
reason
years?
why the U.S. economic growth is slowing down is because the housing market in
Okay.
Europe is not doing well. Like
Let's
there are a
talk about
ton of
European
reasons as to
slowdown.
why U.S.
So
economic
let's talk about
slowdown
like
is happening.
America's effect, like after other countries had slowdowns. In 2014, China's economy slowed down dramatically. What was the effect on America's economy?
It's probably pretty bad.
Nothing. America's economy grew at record paces in 2014. Why is it going to slow down now? Just because Europe's housing
I would
market is
say
slowing down.
one, in 2014, U.S. growth would have been even higher had China not suddenly slowed
Wait.
down.
But
And
it's
two,
like,
I would say that Chinese slowdown probably wasn't very significant
Yeah.
insofar as in 2014
Yeah.
China was still, can I finish?
Yeah.
China was still recording double-digit growth rates.
here, your analysis is that a lack of U.S. growth leads to people pulling out of investment, right? So if America's growing at like 3% versus like 3.5%, they're not going to pull out over that 0.5%, right? It's if America's growth
It's
slows down
linear.
dramatically, right?
No, it's linear. It's that the more U.S. growth slows down, the less willing investors are willing to do, like borrow money and go invest in developing
So-
countries. But I have a question
sure,
for you
go
guys.
ahead.
So you've been spending a lot of time on this. So let's talk about this idea about municipal bonds.
Yeah,
So
sure.
how much money does municipal bonds raise for
So
infrastructure?
specifically, the Oyakajo evidence I read at the end of that argument says in the past 9 years we've raised $1.65 trillion through municipal bonds.
Okay,
So I have a
and
question
in-
for you.
I have a really quick follow-up.
Yeah, sure.
So in times of disaster, why do local governments request federal help?
Wait, okay, yeah, obviously the federal government gives like instant disaster relief.
Right.
But we would say that with more municipal bonds, for example, cities like New Orleans are better able to insulate against the like disaster actually affecting them on the onset. So we would say that municipal bonds still are a preventative measure that are really important.
Okay,
But can I have a question?
Okay, go for it.
Okay, so how often are infrastructure bills passed through Congress?
So I would say that with a Democratic House and a Republican Senate, it's very likely.
No, like maybe it's likely now, but like due to the political process, we usually pass like one infrastructure bill like every like 10, 15 years, right?
That seems like a pretty like one uncarded and two
When was our last
bad
infrastructure spending bill?
analysis. We passed disaster relief bills
Yeah, but that's
in
not like
2017.
wide-scale infrastructure implementation.
Why
And you
not?
tell me with
That's like
Trump,
billions
right?
of dollars
It's
of
$90
infrastructure
billion.
spending.
How much is
Yeah.
Trump's plan?
We're not advocating for Trump's plan.
I know. I'm just saying
We
for
just say
context.
either A, you're going to increase spending in the neg world, or B, you're going to cut spending in the app world.
Sure. Like we would disagree with both of those, but we're out of time.
Is everyone ready? It's gonna be our case and your case. Start in our case, you can group her overview. It doesn't apply to our second warrant about interest rates. But then, at the top of our case, remember Zumbrun says that more than 45% of low-income countries are at the risk of default. And NERM says that if we don't solve our debt right now, millions will go into poverty if they do default. But then, go to our second warrant. You can group all the responses she gives you because she doesn't understand our warrant, and those responses don't apply. It's not about investor demand for treasury bonds because that's always high, but it's about supply. And if the supply of treasury bonds increases, then that means that there's going to be more competition, which means that interest rates are going to rise and the price of bonds are going to decrease while the yield increases because they're inversely related. At that point, you can extend your second warrant because Hicks says the government issues bonds to pay off when the government issues bonds to pay off our federal debt, it leads to increased interest rates. And Sabula says that from 1971 to 2012, 1% increase in the deficit led to a 0.21% increase in interest rates on bonds, which means that it has present and it will happen. And then Bartenstein says that over 2/3 of the debt is held by emerging markets is dollar denominated, and Thorney says that 1% increase in the debt leads to a 1% increase in interest rates in emerging markets. But then at that point, Richter says that if we don't solve this now by 2025, emerging markets will owe $2.7 trillion of US dollar denominated debt. But then go to their case. therapies. First, you can extend our weighing overview. Her first response is that there's a lack of U.S. growth, but U.S. growth is good, like there's no risk of the growth slowing. But then second, on foreign aid, Dean 15 of Princeton University writes that foreign aid means that the regimes are less accountable because they don't have to rely on tax revenue, which means that they can do whatever they want and get away with it. But then you can extend our overview at the point where developing nations should be prioritized because they have a worse safety net, they can't pass fiscal stimulus, but also they're less durable, recessions are longer. But then go to the third response on infrastructure on their remember, so they say that we tell you that an increased interest rates and increased debt means that we have increased interest payments. She says that why can't we just borrow to pay off? But that means that this will just lead to increased interest rates and higher interest payments, which is a cycle, and the government won't do that. But at that point, Peterson says that we can cut spending by 1.8% per year till 2048. In 5 years, it would have to be 21%. In 10 years, it would be 53%. And that links to their cases because that means we would have to cut infrastructure spending a lot more in the future. Thus, weird unaffirmative ballot.
Take the remaining 56 seconds to print.
It's gonna be after me. Is everybody ready? They go for interest rates, but that doesn't get them out of the response that Jackie tells in Rebuttal, where we tell you that U.S. bonds and developing countries' bonds aren't substitutes. That means the investors who buy U.S. bonds will not go over and buy developing countries' bonds. What this means is that the two bonds aren't in competition. So even if United States interest rates were to increase, that doesn't mean that developing country interest rates have to increase to compensate. But then on the specific warrant, realize that even if they try to tell you that supply increases because of the U.S.'s specific bonds, like demand will always increase to compensate. That's for a couple reasons. First, because Bloomberg tells you that they're the safest form of investment, so people always demand them. Second, because our debt to GDP ratio is still really good, so it really doesn't matter. But then finally, because China and other countries are just going to buy more U.S. bonds because they have a bunch of U.S. money and they don't really know what to do with it. That delinks them from increased interest rates. But then, on the negative case, first on the top, they try to tell you that developing countries outweigh, but realize economic growth is a prerequisite because if the U.S. isn't in economic growth, no one's going to invest in developing countries. But then remember that cutting foreign aid is still a lot better to help developing countries because the USAID doesn't give money to governments. They do specific programs that circumvent government corruption. But then on the specific infrastructure response, the only response she gives you is that interest rates increase, so this is really bad. But remember, I give you 3 very specific reasons as to why, because demand doesn't decrease, we can just keep borrowing forever because people will always borrow our bonds. That means you kick out of their turn. That's why you can extend our case where we tell you that Trump's infrastructure bill would probably pass, and even if it doesn't pass, if you prioritize debt reduction, you're only going to cut infrastructure. That's really problematic because we tell you that infrastructure leads to better things like disaster relief. For example, Krauss tells you that every natural disaster increases poverty by 1 percentage point. However, if you invest in disaster relief, then that impact goes away. Second, on jobs, because McKinsey tells you that every time we invest in infrastructure, you create 1.5 million jobs. That gives jobs to people who are unemployed. That's really important because we outweigh on probability. You never know that investors are going to all of a sudden switch their portfolios from U.S. bonds to developing bonds if bonds decrease. But you know that when you invest in infrastructure, you're increasing the resistance of communities to disaster relief, and you're increasing jobs for millions who need it. Therefore, you negate.
Are y'all ready?
Mm-hmm.
let's talk about this idea that demand is going to increase to compensate for any increase in supply, right?
Yeah.
So, like demand, there's a fixed capital pool of money in the world, right? And
Not
in the bond
necessarily.
market, right? Wait, so how are you going to get this capital from the bond market?
No, not necessarily. For example, like when China, like when people like trade, they trade in like U.S. dollars, right?
Right.
Like when they get U.S. dollars and they just have a bunch of U.S. dollars, they're not just gonna hide it under their mattress.
Wait.
They like might as well just make some money off it, so they just like invest in the
I have
bond
a
market.
really
All of
quick
your-
question for you.
Yeah, sure,
though.
go ahead.
So what's the debt right now?
Like high.
Okay, yeah, so it's pretty high. So why haven't interest rates increased appreciably?
They have. The Sebula evidence says that from 1971 to 2012, when controlling for variables, you see a 1% increase in the
What's the
deficit.
bond
as
interest rate right
empirically,
now?
the bond interest rate right now, it will depend on like what
It's
maturity.
2.9%. Why
No,
hasn't it
that's
increased
all-
appreciably?
here, specifically, if you look at the long-term trend, there's an increase as our debt rises.
So why is it
Obviously,
increasing right now?
wait, here. There are yes, there are other variables that affect our debt, but that doesn't respond to our link because the Sebula evidence is isolating the effect outside of these effects, saying that a 1% increase in the deficit leads to a 0.24% increase in
Wait,
the
but
interest
it's
rate.
like
It's an isolation. Confounding variables
Yeah,
don't
I'm
affect
asking
But
you
if
why
other
this-
variables are leading to the treasury yield still being extremely low, then when is your impact actually
Wait, our
going to
treasury yields are like on the rise right now, which is why these developing
No, they're
nations.
not.
No, they're
like
not.
the federal funds interest rate is on the rise, but treasury yield, like
No,
the
no,
interest rate
wait,
on bonds,
two things
are
here.
like just as
First,
low.
the federal funds rate is the yield rate on a certain type of maturity. It's on the 18th month maturity. So when you see that federal
The
funds
federal
rate,
the federal
funds rate
funds
is how
rate
much
is
it
the-
costs for banks to borrow.
yes,
from
but also the way they get that target rate is the Federal Reserve engages in open market operations where they buy and sell
Okay,
bonds to then get to that target interest
It
rate.
doesn't matter. At the point where treasury yields are so low, yet our debt
No.
is so high, how, like, I understand your study. I understand it does the, like, empirical study. I'm asking you right now, with $1 trillion deficits, why are treasury yields dropping?
Yes, because no, again, it doesn't matter whether they're dropping or not because we are isolating the effect for you. The
I know,
But
I'm
that
asking-
means that even if
No,
theoretically
because
they
here-
should be on the rise, like if you actually look at what's manifesting in the
No,
real
no,
world,
this
nothing's
isn't like a
happening.
theoretical study. This is what has happened when you analyze American deficits and American yield rates.
Okay, so then why are treasury yields low?
No, okay, treasury yields, again, two things. One, they are on the rise. You don't read me evidence that they were low any time during the round. You're just asserting that like they're low right now. But two, and more importantly, we are isolating the effect of what happens when deficit rates and the effect from the deficit results in a higher interest rate. Because so much money is being spent, $2.7 trillion, the increase because of the interest rate affects that. Can I have a question?
Yeah.
Okay, so again, back on this idea that demand increases. All of the reasons you read are incentives for people to invest in treasury bonds at all times, right? It's not like, so why does that change just because you increase the supply?
Because demand is so high that it, like, that such changes in supply don't appreciably change the interest rate.
Wait, but that's not like, that's just like not how like supply and demand works, right? Like even
Yeah,
if,
if
no,
the
even
curve
if the
is like
demand is
vertical or
high,
horizontal, then change in one doesn't appreciably
sure,
affect
elasticity
change in-
might be low, but like our studies work. Is everyone ready? Time starts now. Start on our case about the developing nation. The only response they extend is that demand will rise to match any increase in supply. The problem is all of the reasons they give you for why demand are high are already exist in the status quo. The demand always exists. It's not going to change or like increase or decrease just because of a change in supply. These are reasons people will always go to treasury rates. What happens when you vote for us? What happens when you vote for them is the Hicks 18 evidence says that when the government borrows more and more money and sells more and more bonds, that drives up interest rates by driving competition with other bonds. The Sebula evidence says that from 1971 to 2012, a 1% increase in the deficit has led to a 0.21% increase in the interest rate. Don't let them stand up here and make new analysis on interest rates being low. It's A, not made in the round, and B, this is isolating the effect for our case. The Bartenstein evidence says that 2/3 of debt in these developing countries are dollar denominated. This frontlines our idea that there's no substitution effect. The idea is very explicit because they are dollar denominated. When the interest rates rise for dollar denominated bonds, it directly leads to an increase in interest rates. That's why the 4011 evidence that doesn't go responded to says explicitly that a 1% increase in the government deficit in the United States leads to a 0.1% increase in interest rates in emerging markets. That's completely dropped. It's the empiric on what actually happens, which means they can't have access there. The Richter evidence says that by 2025 we'll have $2.7 trillion that developing nations will need to give back. And the Zumbrun evidence says that 45% of low-income nations are on the brink of default, and NERB says that when this crisis happens, millions are going to be pushed into poverty. This outweighs anything they make in the round because developing nations comes first. They can see this. They say a few things. First, they say that America is going to slow down growth, and that's tax bills over and aid. Neither of their analysis are contextualized. We're giving you very explicit. It doesn't matter how much aid we're giving. It doesn't matter how much America's growth is happening. The fact is, when these countries have a recession, higher levels of American growth aren't going to do anything for them. Then on infrastructure, they don't have a link, because if Pearson 18 evidence says that we can cut 1.9% right now, or we can wait 5 years, in which case cutting goes up by 21%. Their only frontline to this is the same frontline they give to our case, which is that demand is going to rise. But remember, all of the analysis they give you for why demand is going to rise is that it says that demand is high. It doesn't say that demand fluctuates with supply. They don't give you any of that analysis. That's not how supply and demand works, and that's why you should affirm.
I'm gonna go AFNet.
I'm gonna start on the top about with the wing. I don't know which side it was going. Okay. Start at the top. They say that developing countries are the most important. We say sure. We say that if you vote AF, you cut things like foreign aid that circumvent corrupt governments to help people out of poverty. This is really important. We are going to outweigh a probability here because you have no idea if investors are suddenly going to shift their portfolio to accommodate bonds that are completely different, but you know that aid programs are happening right now and benefiting people right now. Then on the first, we also say that like U.S. growth reverberates to the entire world, so it's probably good that we prop up U.S. growth because that is what encourages investors to keep borrowing and investing. Then on the first contention about developing countries, the terminal piece of defense that they drop in the round and therefore delinks them from the entire case is that these two bond markets are not comparable. They just say they're both dollar denominated. That just means U.S. investors invest in both developing country bonds and U.S. bonds, but they aren't substitutes, which means that when interest rates go up, even if you buy the interest rates go up on U.S. bonds, developing countries never hike interest rates on their bonds because they're not competing for investors who invest in safe bonds. They're competing for investors who invest in high return bonds. This is really important because as long as U.S. treasuries are comparatively safer, these are no substitutes. That automatically delinks them right there. But then on the analysis about interest rates, they say that, well, we never say demand increases. We say the demand is so high that any increase in supply is negligible. This is why Bloomberg finds that because treasuries are the safest investment, you see foreign investment and foreign purchases of bonds increasing even though our debt is increasing. This is why treasury yields are super low. But second of all, with debt to GDP ratio decreases, you'll never actually see the interest rate rise. And third, China is going to continue buying bonds to continue depreciating its currency, especially when foreign investors are buying Chinese bonds. This is really important because it shows that the interest rate rise never happens, which means they never link to the turn on our contention. That's where you go to infrastructure. This is really important. We tell you in the affirmative world, you cut infrastructure by 28.6%. In the negative world, you pass an infrastructure spending bill. This is really important for two reasons. First, on disaster relief, we tell you disasters increase poverty. The way to solve that for that is spending. That's what Krauss says. But second, on mobility, we say through construction alone, McKinsey tells you you create 1.5 million jobs. On probability, you know these jobs are created, whereas you never know whether or not investors are going to suddenly shift their appetite for risk and all of a sudden invest in developing countries. For those reasons, you negate.
Yeah.
Bless you.
Thank you.
Good round, y'all.
Hey, can I see the card that's the 1%?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Which 1% card? The one about like the debt or about the